Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. This is the Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a Quality Management System, or ISO 9001 Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All participants are on mute, but we absolutely would like to answer your questions if you have any. So please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is, will the slides be available after the presentation is complete? The answer is yes. The slides will be available for download shortly. It should be no more than a day or two after we're finished. And if you would like to re-watch this presentation with voiceover, we do have all previously recorded webinars on our YouTube page, which can be accessed through the PJR website under previously recorded webinars. Our topics for today, we're going to discuss, first of all, just kind of from a definition standpoint, what are statutory and regulatory requirements? We're going to address why statutory and regulatory requirements are included in an ISO 9001 audit. We're going to address where these requirements are found in the ISO 9001:2015 standard. We have some examples to share of how these might come up in the context of an audit, some concluding remarks, and then your questions. So first of all, the definitions for statutory and regulatory requirement. Now both of these are taken from the ISO 9000 document, that is of course the Fundamentals and Vocabulary publication. Statutory requirement is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. A regulatory requirement is similar. It is also an obligatory requirement, but in this case it is specified by an authority that is mandated or empowered, shall we say, by the legislative body. So to understand the difference, the main difference is where the requirements come from. If it's a statutory requirement, that is rooted in the word statutes. And statutes are interchangeable really with laws. That's kind of the terminology. They are legal requirements that come from laws passed by government bodies, Congress, for example. Now, regulatory requirements are going to be rooted in regulations, and they are going to come from bodies that are empowered by the governments that they represent, and oftentimes they are going to represent a deeper dive. So regulations are going to be generally rules that are going to be issued by an agency to which the government has granted authority. A lot of these come from the Code of Federal Regulations, and some of the more common examples are going to be the Food and Drug Administration, the FAA, the FCC, the Department of Transportation, OSHA, and so forth. So a good example of this is the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration is empowered by Congress to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, in terms of the specific requirements that they can enforce, a lot of these are going to come from the Code for Federal Regulations. So for example, labeling and packaging requirements come from Title 21 of the CFR, which is issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So kind of meshing these words together here, meshing these ideas to help you understand the difference. So to simplify it, essentially a statutory requirement is going to be the law. Most often it's going to be very general. Regulations are going to be rules that are developed to interpret the law and ensure that we stay within it, and obviously are going to be more specific. So for example, you might have a statute that says that excessive levels of certain pollutants cannot be permitted in or near major bodies of water. Now the EPA, with its empowerment from the government, would issue then a regulation that tells you, what do we mean by excessive levels? What constitutes a major body of water, and so forth, and also what it plans to do to enforce that statute that Congress passed. So why is PJR involved in all of this? What does any of this have to do with quality system certification? Well, PJR, as you're hopefully aware, is held accountable to a number of requirements in our work as a certification body, and probably none more important than the ISO 17021 series of standards. Now, the primary document is 17021-1 2015. Now, that standard includes a clause that reads as follows: auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So we are required as a certification body to look into the matter of statutory and regulatory requirements through our audit process. Now, ISO 9001:2015, as you have hopefully read, has a number of requirements that mention statutory and regulatory requirements. There are actually 6 of them in total, and I've got them all listed here for us to review. Beginning with Clause 512, Subclause A, where it states that the management of the organization has to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. So this starts with the top management and flows down from there. In 822, Subclause A1, it requires that statutory and regulatory requirements be among the items considered during the contractual phase with customers. So in other words, if a customer comes to you and says, can you provide me this product? Can you provide me this service? Part of what you are expected to do in the analysis before you commit to supplying that product or service to the customer is to consider, are there applicable statutory and regulatory requirements that might impact our ability to provide this product or service? That then continues in 8231 Subclause D, where it states that once you've determined the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, you need to review them, and you need to do so prior to committing to supply a product or service to the customer. Now this continues in section 8.3. 8.3, of course, is the design section, and there it states that you need to include statutory and regulatory requirements among design inputs. So in other words, if you are tasked with designing a product, you need to make sure that you design it in such a way that any applicable statutory and regulatory requirements are going to be met, or at least not violated, by your product design. This continues then in 8.4.2 Subclause C1. Here we're talking about external providers. And here it states that the organization needs to ensure that external providers, whether you are purchasing goods or services and so forth from them, they do not adversely affect compliance to statutory and regulatory requirements. And then finally, in section 855A, you need to consider statutory and regulatory requirements in determining the extent of applicable post-delivery activities. Now what that means is, for example, if you sell a product where there is an existing statute that you need to provide post-life disposal services, we'll go with that. After the product's service life is expended, the manufacturer needs to provide resources for disposal or recycling of that product. If that applies, then that means that you need to determine those requirements and make sure that you've made provisions for those types of activities where applicable. So in terms of how we have approached this as a certification body, we have put a couple of targeted questions in our audit report that pertain to statutory and regulatory requirements. The questions are intended to prompt appropriate investigation and discourse with the auditee. We want this to result in a discussion. We want the auditor to discuss the matter, look into the matter appropriately, and make their conclusions based on what they are told and what they see. Now, in terms of common examples, I've pulled a couple of examples, and these come up most often in the audit reports that we get for ISO 9001-2015. A lot of times we see applicable requirements that reflect on health and safety. So if we're getting into personal protective equipment, ergonomics, safety training, things of this nature, that can have an impact on the system. ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulations. A lot of our clients that sell to the aerospace industry are going to have aspects of ITAR that impact what they do. So this might manifest in controlled access to the facility, controlled access to records, and so forth. Safety data sheets. These were formerly known as material safety data sheets. If you are dealing in chemical-based products, product cleaners, product packaging, raw materials, and so forth, oftentimes the safety data sheets are going to impact how these things are stored, how these things are labeled, things of this nature. So this might come up in the context of an audit. So how are the auditors going to determine what applies? Well, again, as I mentioned, this is going to start with a discussion. We're going to have a very frank discussion with the management team, with the folks that are responsible for the quality management system. And then we will continue with a review of things that we would be looking at, anyway in the context of the audit process. So customer contracts, customer purchase orders, product specifications, even something like your website, we would be looking at to determine what is truly applicable here. Now, I always like to share the limits of our assessment. We have emphasized to our auditors the importance of ensuring that the audit process is limited to confirming that you have an effective process in place for identifying and complying with the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. So again, we kind of harken back to how it's worded in the 17021 standard. In the auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting, excuse me, of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Our job is not to sample the individual requirements themselves. We're not OSHA auditors or EPA auditors and so forth. It begins and ends with, do you have a process for determining what's applicable? Do you have a process for implementing what's applicable? So here is the current version of how this is captured in our audit report. We ask simply, is there an effective process for identification of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements? And are there any current projects or products that you observed during the audit where it was necessary for you to sample overall implementation of the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements? And I've provided two examples here. This is intended to be for a company that supplies to the aerospace industry, where they would have both ITAR and DFARS applicable requirements. So this is a perfect example of how this is going to be captured in the audit workbook. Now, obviously, you might be wondering, is PJR going to be inclined to issue a nonconformance? It is certainly conceivable that an auditor would find a disconnect between an implemented process and an applicable requirement. But whether or not a nonconformance is going to be issued, it requires a bit of discretion. Um, does it impact customer satisfaction or attainment of a quality objective? Does it impede your ability to manufacture your product or render your service? And obviously, if a nonconformance is warranted, the auditor has to ensure that the requirements cited include the appropriate clause or clauses from ISO 9001-2015 itself. That's obviously paramount. We want to make sure that we have appropriate audit criteria. So in conclusion, above all else, we want to ensure that we are providing you with a value-added audit and meeting all applicable requirements. We do hope that you will use the points of this presentation to have a good understanding of what PJR's expectations are going to be when it comes to statutory and regulatory requirements. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have presentations on the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is a review of what is a process and how to understand it. We have a presentation on exemptions, non-applicable clauses, what is acceptable and determining what exemptions are right for you. And we have webinars on a lot of other topics: Stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001 itself, AS, ISO 1345, and so forth. We would love for you to opt in so we can keep in touch with you automatically. If you visit the PJR website at www.pjr.com, at the bottom of the page, if you enter your email address and click subscribe, you'll be automatically opted in for news updates on upcoming webinars and other points of information. I do thank you for your time today. I hope the presentation has been beneficial. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard if anyone has any questions. Any questions today? Okay, thank you all for your time and have a great day.